You've talked about slave narratives and neo-slave narratives. Do you mind articulating what those two are and the difference between them?
Oh, sure. So it depends on where you are as well. So slave narratives either tend to come from British enslavement or tend to come from American enslavement, right? The difference in between the two, and the most famous, of course, Mary Prince and Equiano, connected to British enslavement. Slave narratives that tend to come from British enslavement tend to be from formerly enslaved persons, right? Remember, and for everybody listening, we don't say slave anymore. You don't use that terminology anymore, right? Because a slave ultimately is a noun. Being an enslaved person is different, right? This is more talking about, using it as, here's me as an English instructor, right? As an adjective, right? Rather than this is the whole person, which is what a slave was, what that means, right? Instead, as an enslaved person, you're reminding everyone that these were people. This was the condition. Was enforced upon them, and in Britain's case, they were stolen from their homes and forced into enslavement. The difference with American enslavement, it tends to be, I'm in Baltimore, right? Frederick Douglass. Okay. Frederick Douglass is everywhere. One direction you get Edgar Allan Poe, the other direction you get Fells Point, and you get Frederick Douglass, right? And of course the museum and the Smithsonian, the Sam Museum, in the Portrait Gallery have just placed his daguerreotype in his portrait. I've seen the portrait, haven't seen the daguerreotype before. Back on exhibit, right? Like again, here's Frederick Douglass, but it's a really young Frederick Douglass, and not the stern, right? And again, the photo, the image was taken for a reason, right? But ultimately, this is a reminder, and I put his Frederick Douglass as a young man, when I teach Frederick Douglass, into my teaching to remind students, like, this is how young he was. But again, with American enslavement, these are people who were born into enslavement, and this is all they knew, right? Because you do get persons who say, well, why didn't they just leave? Really? And go where? Right? And with what? These are, if you read Frederick Douglass's narrative, he was born in Maryland. There he was. This is, here's this plantation that he spent, his formative years on. He ultimately was taught and taught himself, mostly learned how to read and write. And as a result, it assisted him in escaping, because it was an escape. He had to leave, or inevitably death, right? Like, this is not, hey, he could just walk away one day and, everything is just peachy, right? And again, you get people who just like, oh yeah, they should have just, how? Right? It wasn't going to happen. People died. And ultimately, these texts should be taught in schools, and we're seeing so much where either people are A, banning them, or B, putting these warnings on these texts, right? Or C, doing what some universities are and saying, well, if you find this triggering, you don't have to read this. You can read something else. And really, no. Everybody should be reading Frederick Douglass's text, or everybody should be reading, Mary Prince's text. Ultimately, ensuring that we all know and remember that these people existed, and here's what happened, that they're only writing these texts, or somebody was writing these texts for them because they couldn't read and they couldn't write, that these texts existed to get people ultimately to support the abolitionist movement. right? Again, I always point to Henry Louis Gates. Always go to his works, right? Because he's the guy and he's written extensively. But so what happened was eventually 20th century writers thought, okay, well, I mean, ultimately we can't forget, but how can we take this experience, this historical moment, this atrocity that happened on American soil, and how can we place this in a modern contemporary text, right? And of course, you get Margaret Walker's Jubilee, you get Octavia Butler's Kindred, you get Toni Morrison's Beloved, right? Gail Jones, again, one of my favorite writers. Wrote my dissertation on her too. Writing about her now. Her Birdcatcher is amazing. But how can you take this experience and write about it from a contemporary perspective and write about it for a contemporary audience? Well, you create the neo-slave narrative, right? But also you can take this structure and offer characters agency that they wouldn't have had before, power over their lives.